The old leather briefcase hit the counsel table like thunder before a storm. Every head in courtroom 302 turned toward the silver-haired woman walking down the center aisle. Judge Stephen Morales froze mid-sentence. His pen stopped moving. His eyes widened behind his glasses as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Why are you here?" he whispered. The question hung in the air like smoke. Lawyers glanced at each other in disbelief. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Evelyn Carter looked him straight in the eye. 25 years of history passed between them in that single moment. "I'm here to represent my son," she said quietly. Attorney Hawthorne's confident expression cracked. "Your Honor, who is this woman?" William Calloway grabbed his daughter's arm. His face had gone pale. "If she's the Evelyn Carter I think she is," he whispered, "we're in trouble." The courtroom held its breath. Something had shifted. The Queen of Law had returned to claim her throne. But no one knew what was about to happen next. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The Cook County Courthouse stood like a granite monument against Chicago's winter sky. Snow fell in thick flakes, covering the steps where lawyers hurried past with their briefcases. The morning air carried the sharp scent of salt and exhaust from Lakeshore Drive. Inside courtroom 302, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The wooden benches creaked as people settled in. Steam rose from coffee cups. Papers rustled. Someone coughed. Evelyn Carter sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap. At 66, she moved with quiet grace. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a navy coat that had seen better days, but her eyes were sharp, alert. They missed nothing. She watched her son Michael wheel himself toward the plaintiff's table. His broad shoulders filled out his dark suit jacket. His hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests. The accident had taken his legs 3 years ago. It hadn't broken his spirit. Beside him walked Brooke. Michael's wife glided across the courtroom floor in designer heels. Her blonde hair caught the light. Her red dress cost more than most people made in a month. She belonged to Chicago's North Shore elite. Old money. Old connections. Brooke's attorney was already at the defendant's table. Richard Hawthorne had silver hair and a $1,000 watch. He shuffled through papers with practiced ease. This case would be simple. A disabled electrician versus a wealthy family? The outcome was obvious. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Everyone stood. Evelyn remained seated until the last moment. Then she rose slowly, her joints protesting after the long drive from the suburbs. Judge Stephen Morales entered from his chambers. He was 52, with graying temples and tired eyes. 20 years on the bench had taught him to spot trouble before it started. He adjusted his black robes and took his seat. "Please be seated," he said. The courtroom settled. Morales picked up his reading glasses and scanned the docket. His voice was steady, professional. "Case number 2025 CV 1847, Carter versus Calloway. Motion for temporary custody of minor child Emma Carter." Brooke's father leaned forward in the gallery. William Calloway owned half the lakefront property in Winnetka. His face was stern, confident. This hearing was just a formality. Attorney Hawthorne stood first. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd never lost a case like this. "Your Honor, my client seeks emergency custody of her 6-year-old stepdaughter. The child's father is no longer capable of proper care due to his disability. We have medical documentation." Objection. The voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Everyone turned. Michael was trying to stand, his hands shaking with effort. "Dad, sit down," someone whispered from the gallery. But it wasn't Michael who had spoken. Evelyn Carter walked down the center aisle. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor. She carried an old leather briefcase, worn smooth from decades of use. The brass clasp caught the light. Judge Morales froze. His pen stopped moving. His eyes widened behind his glasses. The courtroom fell silent. Attorneys glanced at each other. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Evelyn reached the counsel table. She set down her briefcase. The sound was like thunder before a storm. Judge Morales stared at her. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" The question hung in the air. Evelyn looked up at him. Their eyes met across 25 years of history. Attorney Hawthorne frowned. He looked from Evelyn to the judge, then back again. "Your Honor, I don't understand. Who is this woman?" William Calloway's face had gone pale. He grabbed his daughter's arm. "If she's the Evelyn Carter I think she is," he whispered. "We're in trouble." Evelyn opened her briefcase. The leather creaked. Inside were files, notes, and memories of 100 victories. She pulled out a single document. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I'm here to represent my son." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Hawthorne's confident expression cracked. Brooke's hand flew to her throat. Even the bailiff straightened in his chair. Judge Morales removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes like a man trying to wake from a dream. Mr. Carter, he said slowly, you've been retired for 8 years. I never stopped being a lawyer, Evelyn replied. She wasn't just attending her son's trial. She had come to reclaim the courtroom she once ruled. The Queen of Law had returned. 6 months earlier, the autumn leaves had just begun to turn when Michael Carter's world collapsed in 7 seconds. The construction site at Navy Pier was bustling that morning. Workers moved across the scaffolding like ants on a steel web. Michael was checking the electrical panels on the 3rd floor when the support beam gave way. The sound was like thunder splitting the sky. Then silence. He woke up 3 days later in Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The white ceiling tiles seemed to mock him. His legs felt nothing. The doctor's words floated through the morphine haze like distant echoes. Complete spinal cord injury. Tidwell and vertebra. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Brooke stood beside his bed in her cream-colored suit. Her face was pale but composed. She held his hand, but her grip felt cold, distant. We'll figure this out, she whispered. But even then, something in her voice had changed. The insurance battle began 2 weeks later. Michael's disability claim sat on an adjuster's desk in downtown Chicago. The man behind the desk wore a cheap tie and cheaper cologne. His nameplate read Dennis Walsh. Pre-existing condition, Walsh said, tapping his pen against the file. Lower back pain documented 18 months ago. Evelyn had driven in from Schaumburg for the meeting. She sat across from Walsh, her hands folded in her lap. Her voice was calm but firm. My son pulled a muscle moving furniture. That's not a spinal injury. Company policy is clear, ma'am. We have to protect ourselves from fraud. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She'd heard that tone before. It was the voice of someone who'd already made up his mind. This is wrong, she said quietly. Walsh shrugged. You can appeal. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. The appeal took 3 months. Evelyn spent her retirement savings on legal fees. She filed motions, gathered medical records, and interviewed witnesses. She even drove to the construction site at dawn to photograph the broken beam. Nothing worked. The insurance company had better lawyers. More money. More time. The denial letter arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn read it twice, then set it down on her kitchen table. The words blurred through tears she refused to shed. Michael took the news in silence. He sat in his wheelchair by the living room window, staring out at the street. His hands lay still in his lap. He hadn't spoken in 3 days. Brooke paced behind him like a caged animal. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the house like gunshots. We can't live like this, she said finally. Michael didn't respond. He just watched the leaves fall outside. That was when things began to change. Brooke started working late. She'd leave the house at 7 in the evening, dressed in her finest clothes. Her perfume lingered in the hallway long after she was gone. Client dinner, she'd explain when Michael asked. But real estate agents didn't have client dinners 3 nights a week. Evelyn knew this. She'd watched her daughter-in-law's calendar. The meetings weren't there. Brooke's phone calls became whispered conversations behind closed doors. She'd disappear into the spare bedroom with her cell phone pressed to her ear. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear, intimate, secretive. Michael pretended not to notice. He'd developed a talent for silence. He spent his days reading technical manuals and watching cooking shows. He practiced moving from his wheelchair to the couch until his arms ached. Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, tried to fill the quiet spaces. She'd climb onto his lap and show him her drawings. Her small hands would pat his face when he looked sad. Are you okay, Daddy? She'd ask. I'm fine, sweetheart, he'd lie. But children see things adults miss. Emma began having nightmares. She'd wake up crying for her grandmother. Evelyn would drive over at midnight to rock her back to sleep. The house itself seemed to absorb the tension. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now held only whispers and sighs. It was the same house where Michael had learned to walk, where he'd brought Brooke as a newlywed, where Emma had taken her first steps. Evelyn's late husband had built it brick by brick in 1978. Thomas Carter had been a carpenter, a man who understood the weight of wood and the strength of stone. He laid the foundation with his own hands. Every beam, every board, every nail had been placed with love. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. It was the only thing of value the family had left. That was when Brooke made her suggestion. She brought it up over dinner on a cold November evening. The smell of takeout Chinese food filled the kitchen. Michael pushed low mean around his plate without eating. I've been thinking, Brooke said carefully. Maybe we should sell the house. The words hit the table like a dropped stone. Michael looked up. Evelyn, who'd been visiting for dinner, set down her chopsticks. Sell the house? Michael's voice was barely audible. It's too big for us now, Brooke continued. The stairs, the maintenance. We could get something smaller, more practical. She didn't mention the equity. Nearly $400,000. Enough to start over somewhere else. This is my father's house, Michael said quietly. Your father's been dead for 10 years, Brooke snapped. Then she caught herself. Her voice softened. I just think it might be better. You know? Evelyn said nothing, but her hands were shaking. The conversation ended there, but the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Brooke brought up the house sale repeatedly. She left real estate listings on the kitchen counter. She mentioned how much the neighbors had gotten for their places. She talked about condos in the city with elevators and wheelchair access. Michael began to waver. Maybe she was right. Maybe the house was too much. Maybe he was being selfish. Evelyn watched it all from the sidelines. She saw how Brooke's arguments slowly wore down her son's resistance. She noticed how the conversations always happened when Michael was tired, vulnerable. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in December. Evelyn had stopped by to bring Emma some hot chocolate. The little girl was in bed with a fever. The house was quiet except for the sound of the furnace running. She was in the kitchen when she heard Brooke's voice from the next room. Her daughter-in-law was on the phone, speaking in low tones. Once the house is in my name, we're set, Brooke whispered. He won't even know what hit him. The words cut through Evelyn like ice. She stood frozen by the sink, her hand still gripping Emma's empty mug. The lawyer says it's simple, Brooke continued. Power of attorney for medical decisions. Then we expand it to financial. He's so depressed he'll sign anything. Evelyn's chest tightened. She'd heard that tone before. In courtrooms. From witnesses who thought they were too smart to get caught. Just be patient, Brooke said. A few more weeks and it's done. The call ended. Footsteps moved toward the kitchen. Evelyn quickly turned on the faucet and began washing the mug. Her hands were steady despite the storm in her chest. Brooke appeared in the doorway. Her face was flushed. Guilty. Oh, hi, Evelyn. I didn't know you were still here. Just cleaning up, Evelyn replied calmly. They stood in silence for a moment. Two women who'd never really trusted each other. Now they were enemies, though only one of them knew it. That night, Evelyn drove home through the empty streets of Schaumburg. Snow was beginning to fall. The streetlights looked like halos in the darkness. She sat in her car in the driveway for 10 minutes thinking. The instincts she'd developed over 30 years as a public defender were stirring. She could smell deception the way others smelled smoke. For the first time in 8 years, the Queen of Law began to wake up. The next morning, Evelyn started a new file. She labeled it Carter versus Calloway and placed it in her old briefcase. The leather was worn, but the brass clasp still clicked shut with authority. She had work to do. The morning came like a blade through winter clouds. February ice covered the windows of the Carter house. Inside, Michael sat at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold. He stared at the newspaper, but couldn't focus on the words. Emma was upstairs getting ready for school. Her footsteps echoed through the ceiling like small thunder. She'd been asking questions lately. Where was Mommy going? Why did Daddy look sad? Children notice silence before adults admit it exists. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Michael wheeled himself to the front door. Through the frosted glass, he could see two figures standing on the porch. One was tall. The other was familiar. He opened the door to find Brooke standing beside a stranger. She wore her black wool coat and leather gloves. Her makeup was perfect despite the early hour. The man next to her carried a briefcase and wore the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Michaelman, Brooke said. Her voice was crisp, professional. This is David Goldman, my attorney. Goldman stepped forward and extended his hand. His grip was firm but cold. His suit cost more than Michael made in a month when he still had a job. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. Michael's stomach dropped. He knew that tone. It was the voice people used when they delivered bad news. What's going on? He asked. Brooke pushed past him into the house. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Goldman followed, setting his briefcase on the dining room table with practiced precision. We need to talk, Brooke and Wordikishitim. Michael closed the door. The sound echoed through the house like a coffin lid. He wheeled himself into the dining room where Goldman was already opening his briefcase. The lawyer pulled out a stack of papers. The pages were crisp white with legal headers, official seals, signatures waiting to be filled in. Mr. Carter, Goldman began, my client has asked me to prepare these documents for your review. He slid the papers across the table. Michael's hands shook as he picked them up. The words swam before his eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Division of marital property. Custody arrangements. Divorce papers, he whispered. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything. Brooke sat across from him. She folded her hands on the table. Her wedding ring caught the morning light streaming through the window. Michael, sign these, she said calmly. It's better for everyone this way. Michael looked up at her. The woman he'd married 6 years ago. The woman who'd promised to love him through sickness and health. Her blue eyes were cold now, distant. This was supposed to be our home, he said. His voice broke on the last word. Things change, Worsmont, Brooke replied. You're not the same man I married. The words hit him like physical blows. He thought about the construction site, the sound of breaking steel. The moment his legs stopped working. Had she stopped loving him then? Or had it happened slowly, like ice forming on a pond? Goldman cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, under Illinois marital law, your wife is entitled to half of all community property acquired during the marriage. Half the house, Brooke added. Her voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. Michael stared at the papers. The house where he'd grown up, where his father had taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, where he'd proposed to Brooke on Christmas morning, where Emma had taken her first steps in the living room. I need time to think, he said. There's nothing to think about, Brooke snapped. Just sign them. That was when Evelyn walked in. She'd been upstairs helping Emma get ready for school. Her footsteps on the stairs were soft but steady. She appeared in the dining room doorway like a ghost from another time. Goldman looked up from his papers. And you are? Evelyn Carter, she said quietly. Michael's mother. She moved into the room with the grace of someone who'd spent decades walking into hostile territory. Her gray hair was pulled back. Her clothes were simple but clean. She carried herself like a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Mrs. Carter, Goldman said, this is a private matter between your son and his wife. Evelyn pulled out a chair and sat down. She looked at the papers spread across the table. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning the legal language with the skill of someone who'd read thousands of similar documents. On what grounds? She asked. Brooke frowned. What? The divorce. On what grounds are you filing? Goldman shifted in his seat. Irreconcilable differences. Standard procedure. And the property division? Evelyn continued. Community property laws, Brooke said. Her voice carried a hint of irritation. Everything acquired during marriage is split 50-50. Evelyn nodded slowly. She picked up one of the papers and studied it carefully. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Interesting, she said finally. What's interesting? Goldman asked. Evelyn set down the paper. She looked directly at Brooke. This house was purchased in March 2018, she said calmly. You were married in September 2018. The words hit the table like stones dropped into still water. Goldman's confident expression flickered. Brooke's face went pale. That's not right, Brooke said quickly. I have the deed, Evelyn replied, and the marriage certificate. The house was purchased 5 months before your wedding? Goldman reached for his briefcase. His hands moved quickly through papers. Legal documents. Property records. His face grew red as he searched. That would make it separate property, he admitted reluctantly. Not community property, Evelyn agreed. The silence that followed was deafening. Brooke stared at Evelyn with undisguised hatred. Her carefully planned attack had crumbled in less than a minute. Don't act like you still matter, Brooke snapped. You're just an old woman who doesn't understand how the world works anymore. Evelyn smiled faintly. It was the same smile she'd used in courtrooms when opposing counsel made a fatal mistake. Old doesn't mean powerless, she said softly. Goldman packed his papers with jerky movements. His confidence had evaporated like morning mist. He'd been outmaneuvered by a retired public defender in her kitchen. We'll need to review the timeline, he muttered. You do that, Evelyn said. Brooke stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. This isn't over, you don't, she said. No, Evelyn agreed. It's not. Brooke stormed out of the house. Goldman followed, his briefcase clutched against his chest like armor. The front door slammed behind them with a sound like thunder. Michael sat in his wheelchair staring at the divorce papers scattered across the table. His hands were still shaking. Mom, he whispered. What just happened? She tried to steal your father's house, Evelyn said simply. That night, Evelyn climbed the narrow stairs to her attic. The old boards creaked under her feet. Dust motes danced in the beam from her flashlight. The air smelled of cedar and forgotten memories. In the corner sat an old trunk. The brass hinges were green with age but still strong. Inside were the remnants of her legal career. Files from cases she'd won and lost. Citations from the Bar Association. A photograph of her law school graduation class. At the bottom lay her briefcase, the same leather case she'd carried for 30 years. The brass clasps were tarnished, but they still clicked shut with authority. She lifted it out carefully. The weight felt familiar in her hands. Inside were empty folders waiting for new cases. A legal pad with pages still clean. Pens that still wrote. For 15 years, this briefcase had gathered dust. The Queen of Law had retired, faded away, become just another grandmother in the suburbs. But some things never really die. They just sleep until they're needed again. The next morning, Evelyn made one phone call. She dialed a number she hadn't used in 8 years. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Medina Law Offices. Robert, so she said quietly. It's Evelyn Carter. I need your help again. The pause on the other end told her everything. Robert Medina had been her investigator for 20 years. He'd helped her win cases that seemed impossible. He'd found witnesses who didn't want to be found. Evidence that didn't want to be discovered. Evelyn, he said finally, I thought you were retired. I was sure you, she replied. But family changes everything. She explained the situation quickly. Brooke's threats, the attempted property grab, the divorce papers designed to steal her son's inheritance. What do you need? Why, Robert asked. Everything, Evelyn said. Phone records, financial statements, where she goes at night, who she's seeing. I want to know what she had for breakfast this morning. That's going to take time. And money. I have both. And if we find something? Evelyn looked out her kitchen window at the house where her son was probably staring at divorce papers, where her granddaughter was asking questions no 6-year-old should have to ask. Then we go to war, she said quietly. The Queen of Law was awake. Robert Medina's office smelled of coffee and old cigarettes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cluttered desk. Manila folders lay scattered like fallen leaves. Each one contained pieces of someone's broken life. Evelyn sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been waiting for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of wondering what secrets her daughter-in-law was hiding. 3 weeks of watching Michael grow thinner and quieter. Robert was 62, with silver hair and tired eyes. He'd been a private investigator for 30 years. Before that, he'd been a cop. He knew how to read people's faces when he delivered bad news. You're not going to like this, he said quietly. He opened the top folder and spread photographs across the desk. The images were crisp and clear, professional quality. Brooke in a red dress, laughing at an expensive restaurant. Brooke in a hotel lobby checking her watch. Brooke in a parking garage counting money. But it was the man beside her that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Travis Lane was 45, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that belonged in a toothpaste commercial. His suits cost more than most people's cars. His business cards read Lane Development Group in gold lettering. Who is he? Evelyn asked. Real estate developer, Robert replied. Specializes in luxury condos. Has a reputation for buying properties cheap and flipping them fast. How cheap? Robert pulled out another folder. Bank statements, property records, phone logs. He targets homeowners in financial trouble, Robert explained. Offers them quick cash, then forecloses when they can't pay. Sometimes he pays people to create the financial trouble in the first place. The words hit Evelyn like ice water. She stared at the photographs again. Brooke's smile looked different now. Predatory. How long has this been going on? 6 months. Started right after your son's accident. Robert spread out more evidence. Phone records showing dozens of calls between Brooke and Travis, bank transfers from his account to hers, cash deposits that didn't match her real estate commissions. She's been paid $60,000, Robert said. In exchange for what, we don't know yet. But Evelyn knew. She could see the pattern forming like storm clouds on the horizon. The pressure to sell the house, the divorce papers, the timeline that would leave Michael with nothing. There's more, Robert said reluctantly. He handed her a small recording device, the kind investigators used for surveillance. His face was grim. I picked this up yesterday. Outside Goldman's office. Evelyn pressed play. Static filled the air, then voices. Brooke's voice clear and cold. He's not a husband anymore. He's a liability. Goldman's voice responded, muffled but audible. The disability makes the case more complex. Judges are sympathetic to injured veterans. He wasn't in the military, Brooke snapped. He was just a construction worker who couldn't watch where he was going. The cruelty in her voice cut through the room like broken glass. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. Once I get custody of Emma, the house is mine, Brooke continued. Travis says he can have it condemned within 6 months. Some kind of electrical problem. Michael won't be able to fight it. And if he tries? Brooke's laugh was like ice cracking. What's he gonna do? Roll after me? The recording ended. Silence filled the office like smoke after a fire. Evelyn stared at the machine, her chest tight with rage. I'm sorry, Robert said quietly. Evelyn drove home through the afternoon traffic. The recording played over and over in her mind. Each word felt like a knife twist. She thought about Michael, probably sitting alone in his wheelchair, unaware that his wife was planning to destroy him completely. She found him in his bedroom, staring out the window at the backyard. The blinds were half closed, casting prison bar shadows across the walls. He hadn't shaved in days. His clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. Michael, she called softly. He didn't respond. He just sat there, watching the snow fall on the garden his father had planted 20 years ago. I brought you some soup, she tried again. I'm not hungry, he whispered. Those were the only words he'd spoken all day. The only words he'd spoken all week. The man who used to fill rooms with laughter had become a ghost in his own house. That evening, the sound of raised voices drifted up from the kitchen. Evelyn was in the living room, helping Emma with her homework, when she heard Brooke's voice cut through the air like a blade. You need to understand something, Michael. I'm done pretending this marriage works. Emma looked up from her math problems. Her small face was worried. Why is Mommy angry? She whispered. Sometimes adults have disagreements, Evelyn said gently. But this wasn't a disagreement. This was an execution. Michael's voice was barely audible through the walls. What do you want from me? I want you to stop being pathetic, Brooke snapped. Sign the papers. Move out. Let me get on with my life. This is my life too. No, it won't. No, it's not. Not anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's pencil stopped moving. She looked toward the kitchen with the wisdom children develop when their world starts breaking apart. Grandma, she whispered, is Daddy okay? Before Evelyn could answer, they heard Michael's wheelchair moving across the kitchen floor, the sound of the back door opening, then closing. The house fell quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the grandfather clock. An hour later, Evelyn heard Brooke's car start in the driveway. The engine faded into the distance, leaving only silence behind. She found Michael in his room with the door locked. She knocked softly. Son, can I come in? I want to be alone, came the muffled reply. Michael, please. Just leave me alone, Mom. So she sat outside his door. All night, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out on the carpet. The hallway was dark except for the light seeping under his door. She could hear him moving around inside, the creak of his wheelchair, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Sometime after midnight, she heard him crying. Soft, broken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest. The sound a man makes when he thinks no one can hear him fall apart. She pressed her hand against the door. Son, she whispered, your life isn't over. You just forgot who raised you. The crying stopped, but he didn't answer. She stayed there until dawn, watching the light slowly creep across the hallway carpet. Her joints ached from sitting on the floor all night, but she didn't move. Mothers don't abandon their children, even when those children are 38 years old and broken. The next morning brought a new horror. Evelyn was making coffee when she heard voices from the living room. Brooke had returned early, dressed in her best suit. She sat on the couch beside Emma, who was still in her pajamas. Sweetheart, Brooke was saying, Mommy needs you to do something important. Emma nodded solemnly. She trusted her stepmother completely. You know how Daddy has been sick lately? Brooke continued. He's sad, Emma said quietly. That's right. He's very sad. And sometimes when people are that sad, they can't take care of little girls properly. Emma's eyes widened. Is Daddy going to get better? I don't know, honey. But there are some nice people who want to help. They're going to ask you some questions. What kind of questions? Brooke's voice became softer, more persuasive. They might ask if you feel safe with Daddy, if you want to keep living here. I like living here, Emma said. But wouldn't you rather live somewhere new? Somewhere bigger and prettier? Emma considered this. With Daddy? Well, sweetheart, that's the thing. Daddy might not be able to come with us. But you and Mommy could have a beautiful new house. With a swimming pool. Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. Why can't Daddy come? Because Daddy is sick, remember? And sometimes sick people need to be alone to get better. Evelyn stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. She watched her granddaughter's innocence being weaponized against her own son. The child's trust being twisted into betrayal. So, when the nice people ask you, Brooke continued, you should tell them that you don't want to live with Daddy anymore. That you want to live with Mommy. Can you remember that? Emma nodded slowly, but her eyes were full of tears. I don't want Daddy to be alone, she whispered. He won't be alone forever, Brooke lied. But right now, this is what's best for everyone. That was when the line was crossed. The moment Evelyn's restraint finally shattered. She walked into the living room. Her footsteps were soft but deliberate. Brooke looked up, startled. Emma, Evelyn said gently, why don't you go upstairs and get dressed for school? The little girl looked between her grandmother and stepmother. She could feel the tension in the air, like electricity before a storm. Go ahead, sweetheart, Evelyn said. Emma scampered upstairs. Her footsteps faded into the distance. Evelyn and Brooke faced each other across the living room. Two women who had pretended to be family. Two women who now stood on opposite sides of a war. You will not use that child, Evelyn said quietly. Brooke stood up. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment at being caught. She's my stepdaughter. I'll do what's best for her. What's best for her is staying with her father. Her father is a cripple who can't even take care of himself. The word hung in the air like poison. Evelyn felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Get out of my son's house, she said. It's not his house much longer, Brooke replied with a smirk. But something in Evelyn's expression made her step backward. The old woman's eyes had changed. The grandmother was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. We'll see about that, Evelyn said. That night, after Brooke had left and Emma was asleep, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. She drew charts, family trees, timelines, evidence lists. For 30 years, she had fought for other people's children, defended other people's homes, protected other people's families. Now it was time to fight for her own. The Queen of Law was no longer sleeping. She was preparing for war. 25 years ago, courtroom 302 looked the same wooden benches, the same fluorescent lights humming overhead, the same marble floor that echoed with footsteps and whispered promises. But the woman standing at the defense table was different. Evelyn Carter wore a sharp navy suit. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a professional bun. Her briefcase sat open before her, files organized with military precision. At 41, she commanded the courtroom like a general commanding troops. The prosecution table held 3 lawyers in expensive suits. They represented the Chicago Transit Authority. Their client had fired union electrician Danny Rodriguez after he'd reported safety violations. The case was simple. David versus Goliath. Judge Stephen Morales was 32 then, young and ambitious. His black robes were new, still crisp from the cleaners. His gavel gleamed under the lights. He'd been appointed 6 months ago through connections his family had paid good money to secure. Ms. Carter, he said, call your first witness. Evelyn stood. Her voice carried across the courtroom like a bell. Your Honor, the defense calls Maria Rodriguez. The woman who approached the witness stand was small and tired. She worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children. Her husband's firing had left them facing eviction. Her hands shook as she placed them on the Bible. Evelyn's questions were precise, gentle. She drew out the truth like water from a well. Danny Rodriguez hadn't been a troublemaker. He'd been a man trying to keep his coworkers safe. The jury listened. They believed, but something was wrong. Evelyn could feel it in the air, like electricity before a storm. Judge Morales avoided her eyes. His ruling seemed predetermined. Key evidence was excluded on technical grounds that made no sense. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all charges. Danny Rodriguez lost his pension, his benefits, his future. The Transit Authority escaped responsibility once again. Evelyn sat in stunned silence as the jury filed out. She'd won cases like this before. Dozens of them. This should have been easy. That night, she worked late in her office. The building was empty except for security guards and cleaning crews. She spread case files across her desk, searching for what she'd missed. The evidence was solid. The witnesses were credible. The law was clear. She was still there at midnight when her phone rang. Ms. Carter, the voice was nervous. Yuan, who is this? I work for the Transit Authority, legal department. I can't give you my name. Evelyn gripped the phone tighter. What do you want? I know why you lost today. Judge Morales took money. $50,000. My boss bragged about it. The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd suspected corruption before, but this was different. This was proof. Can you testify to that? I can't. I have a family. But I thought you should know. The line went dead. For 3 weeks, Evelyn investigated. She followed paper trails and recorded conversations. She gathered evidence the way she'd gathered it in courtrooms for 15 years. Methodically. Relentlessly. When she had enough, she called the FBI. The investigation took 6 months. Judge Morales fought the charges with lawyers his family's money couldn't really afford anymore. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, phone taps, witnesses who finally found courage to speak. He was convicted on 8 counts of bribery, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, disbarred, destroyed. But the scandal destroyed Evelyn too. Defense attorneys weren't supposed to report judges. It broke the unspoken rules of the legal community. Other judges began ruling against her. Prosecutors stopped offering reasonable plea deals. Her clients suffered because their lawyer had dared to speak truth to power. The phone calls began after midnight. Threats, promises of violence if she didn't stop causing trouble. Someone threw a brick through her office window. Someone else slashed her car tires. The final blow came from an unexpected source. The State Bar Association opened an ethics investigation. They claimed she'd mishandled client funds. The charges were false, but fighting them would have cost everything she had left. So she surrendered her license, quietly, without explanation. The last case she ever tried was a custody dispute, a father fighting for visitation rights with his daughter. She won, but it felt like defeat. That night, she went home to her small house in Schaumburg. She packed her files in boxes. Her certificates went into storage. Her briefcase disappeared into the attic. Thomas Carter found her sitting at the kitchen table with tears on her cheeks. "I tried to do the right thing," she whispered. "I know," he said, holding her close. "It wasn't enough. It was enough for the people you helped." She retired to raise Michael, to tend her garden, to pretend the courtroom had never existed. Stephen Morales served 4 years in prison. When he was released, he was a broken man. His family had disowned him. His friends had vanished. His future looked as empty as his bank account. But prison had changed him. He'd read law books to pass the time. He'd counseled other inmates facing appeals. He'd discovered what justice actually meant when you had nothing left to lose. It took him 10 years to rebuild his life. He worked as a paralegal, then a courthouse clerk. He attended night school and passed the bar exam on his third try. He volunteered at legal aid clinics. He represented the poor and forgotten. Eventually, the same legal community that had destroyed him decided he'd earned redemption. He was appointed to the municipal court, then the circuit court. His second chance became everyone's second chance. Now, 25 years later, those same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same marble floor echoed with the same footsteps. But everything had changed. Judge Morales removed his glasses and looked at the woman who had once destroyed his life. The woman who had taught him what courage actually cost. "You're the reason I came back to law," he said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes across the years of pain and redemption. Her voice was steady, certain. "Then let's see if you still remember justice." History was about to repeat itself, but this time she would write the ending. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 302. Dust motes danced in the golden light like tiny spirits. The air smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. Everyone had returned from lunch break, but the tension remained thick as fog. Attorney Hawthorne stood at the plaintiff's table, adjusting his silk tie. His confidence had returned during the break. He'd made phone calls, reviewed his strategy, convinced himself that one old woman couldn't derail his carefully planned victory. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "My client's case is straightforward." He pulled out a folder thick with documents, property assessments, insurance papers, mortgage statements. Each page looked official and important. Under Illinois law, all assets acquired during marriage become community property. Mrs. Calloway is entitled to her fair share. Brooke sat beside him in her pearl gray suit. Her blonde hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. She looked like the grieving wife who deserves sympathy and compensation. Michael sat alone at the defendant's table. His wheelchair was positioned awkwardly beside the wooden chair meant for lawyers. His hands rested in his lap, fingers interlocked. He stared at the table's scarred surface as if trying to disappear into the wood grain. Behind him, Evelyn sat in the gallery's front row. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She wore her navy coat over a white blouse. Her hands held a manila folder that seemed thin compared to Hawthorne's evidence pile. "Furthermore," Hawthorne continued, "my client has serious concerns about the child's welfare. Mr. Carter's disability makes it impossible for him to provide adequate care." The words hit the courtroom like stones thrown into still water. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Michael's shoulders sagged further. Hawthorne placed photographs on the evidence table. Images of Michael's wheelchair. Medical reports documenting his injuries. A psychologist's evaluation questioning his mental state. "The child needs stability," Hawthorne said. "She needs a parent who can chase after her in the playground, drive her to dance lessons, provide the active lifestyle children deserve." Judge Morales listened with careful attention. His face revealed nothing, but his fingers drummed silently against his gavel. Brooke dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The performance was subtle but effective. She looked like a woman torn between love and duty. "Your Honor," Hawthorne concluded, "we ask the court to grant emergency custody to my client and order the immediate sale of the marital home. Silence filled the courtroom. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked like a bomb counting down. Michael's breathing was shallow and quick. That was when Evelyn stood. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor echoed through the room. Every head turned. Every eye focused on the gray-haired woman walking slowly toward the counsel table. "Objection, Your Honor." The words cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Hawthorne spun around, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. "Who are you?" he demanded. Evelyn reached the counsel table. She set down her manila folder with deliberate precision. The sound was soft but somehow final. "Evelyn Carter," she said calmly. "I represent my son." Gasps rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Reporters in the back row leaned forward. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. Hawthorne's confident expression cracked. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Carter hasn't practiced law in years." 8 years, Evelyn corrected. "My license remains active." Judge Morales removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. When he replaced them, his eyes met Evelyn's across 25 years of shared history. "Ma'am, Carter," he said quietly. "Are you sure about this?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. He was asking if she was ready to return to the battlefield that had once destroyed her. If she was prepared to risk everything again. Evelyn's voice was steady as stone. "I didn't come this far to watch lies win." The courtroom fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. Evelyn opened her folder. Inside were documents that told a different story. Property deeds, purchase agreements, timeline charts written in her careful handwriting. "Your Honor, may I present evidence?" Morales nodded. "Proceed." Evelyn pulled out the first document, the house deed, dated March 15th, 2018. She held it up so the courtroom could see the official seal. "This property was purchased by Michael Carter on March 15th, 2018, she announced, 5 months before his marriage to the plaintiff. She handed the deed to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Morales. Hawthorne's face went pale. "Under Illinois law," Evelyn continued, "property acquired before marriage remains separate property, not subject to division." Brooke's tissue froze halfway to her eyes. Her perfect composure began to crack. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I have evidence that this custody petition is not motivated by concern for the child's welfare." She pulled out a small recording device, the same one Robert Medina had given her weeks ago. It looked insignificant sitting on the table, but its contents would change everything. "This recording was made 3 days ago," Evelyn said. "It captures the plaintiff coaching her stepdaughter to lie under oath." Hawthorne shot to his feet. "Objection! This is inadmissible." "The child was not in custody," Evelyn replied calmly. "No Miranda rights required. And Illinois is a one-party consent state for recordings." Judge Morales considered this. The legal arguments were sound. More importantly, the truth was more valuable than technicalities. "I'll allow it," he decided. Evelyn pressed play. Brooke's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. The same words Evelyn had heard that morning seemed even more cruel in the formal setting. "Sweetheart, when the nice people ask you questions, you should tell them you don't want to live with Daddy anymore." Emma's small voice responded, confused and frightened. "Why can't Daddy come with us?" "Because Daddy is sick, remember? Sometimes sick people need to be alone." The recording continued for 2 minutes. 2 minutes of a child's innocence being weaponized against her own father. When it ended, the courtroom was completely silent. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. Even the bailiff looked shocked. Brooke's face had gone white as paper. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table. "That's enough," Judge Morales said quietly. But Evelyn had one more card to play. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. Emma Carter." The courtroom exploded. Voices rose in protest and confusion. Hawthorne was on his feet again, objecting to everything he could think of. "She's only 6 years old," he shouted. "Old enough to know her own mind," Evelyn replied. Morales banged his gavel 3 times. The sound echoed off the walls like gunshots. "Silence one," he commanded. "I'll allow the child to speak, but in chambers, not in open court." 10 minutes later, they were all crowded into Judge Morales' private office. Emma sat in a chair that dwarfed her small frame. Her legs didn't reach the floor. She wore a pink dress with white flowers. Michael had wheeled himself in. His face was tight with worry. He hated putting his daughter through this, but he understood the necessity. Brooke sat as far away as possible. She wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Emma," Judge Morales said gently, "do you know why we're here?" The little girl nodded. "Mommy wants me to live somewhere else." "And how do you feel about that?" Emma's lower lip trembled. She looked at her father, then at her grandmother, then back at the judge. "I just want to stay with Daddy and Grandma," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. No coaching, no manipulation, just a child who loved her family. "Why?" Judge Morales asked. "Because they love me," Emma said simply. "And I love them too." Tears rolled down Michael's cheeks. He reached out and took his daughter's small hand in his. Judge Morales made notes on his legal pad. When he looked up, his decision was already written on his face. "I've heard enough," he said. They returned to the courtroom for his ruling. The gallery was packed now. Word had spread about the dramatic testimony. Even other lawyers had slipped in to watch the Queen of Law's return. "In the matter of Carter versus Calloway," Judge Morales began, "this court finds that the petitioner has failed to demonstrate grounds for emergency custody." Brooke's shoulders sagged. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shrugged it off. "Furthermore," Morales continued, "the evidence suggests that this petition was filed in bad faith, as part of a scheme to defraud the defendant of his property." He looked directly at Brooke. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned the hard way about justice and redemption. "Petition denied. Custody remains with the father." The gavel came down with finality. It was over. Brooke stood slowly, her face a mask of defeated rage. She looked at Evelyn one last time. The grandmother who had destroyed her carefully laid plans. "This isn't finished," she said quietly. "Yes," Evelyn replied, "it is." The Queen of Law had returned, and justice, after years of sleeping, was finally awake. The afternoon light had shifted in courtroom 302. Shadows stretched longer across the marble floor. The air held the weight of anticipation, thick as summer humidity before a storm breaks. Judge Morales sat behind his bench, reading from the legal pad where he'd written his decision. His voice was steady, professional, but something deeper ran beneath the words. 25 years of experience, 4 years in prison, a lifetime of learning what justice truly meant. "In the matter of Carter versus Calloway," he began, "this court has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented." The gallery was packed. Word had spread through the courthouse about the dramatic return of Evelyn Carter. Lawyers had slipped in during their breaks. Court clerks stood in the doorway. Even the janitor had paused his work to listen. Michael sat in his wheelchair at the counsel table. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, Evelyn sat with perfect posture, her old briefcase closed and ready. Her face revealed nothing, but her eyes never left the judge. At the plaintiff's table, Brooke stared straight ahead. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Hawthorne shuffled papers needlessly, already knowing his carefully planned victory had crumbled. "First, regarding the petition for dissolution of marriage," Morales continued, "the court finds irreconcilable differences have been established. The marriage is hereby dissolved." A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. The divorce itself was no surprise. Everyone had expected that much. "However," Morales said, his voice growing stronger, "the court finds that the petitioner's claims regarding property division are without merit." Brooke's shoulders tensed. Her lawyer placed a warning hand on her arm. "The evidence clearly establishes that the family home was purchased by the defendant prior to marriage. Under Illinois law, this constitutes separate property, not subject to division." The words hit Brooke like physical blows. She'd counted on that house. It was worth $400,000, money that would have set her up for life. "Furthermore," Morales continued, regarding the petition for emergency custody modification, this was the moment that mattered most. Michael's breathing became shallow. His daughter's future hung on the next words. "The court finds that the petitioner has failed to demonstrate that the current custody arrangement is not in the child's best interest." Relief flooded through Michael like warm water. But Morales wasn't finished. "In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. The recorded conversation presented by the defense shows a deliberate attempt to coach the child into making false statements." He looked directly at Brooke. His expression was stern but not cruel. It was the look of someone who'd seen manipulation from both sides of the courtroom. Such behavior is not only reprehensible, but potentially criminal. "This court is referring the matter to the state's attorney for possible prosecution." Brooke's face went ashen. Criminal charges meant more than losing the custody case. It meant potential jail time. A criminal record. The end of her real estate career. "Therefore," Morales announced, "custody remains with the father. Full custody with the grandmother designated as co-guardian." The gallery erupted in quiet applause. Not the wild cheering of a basketball game, but the respectful acknowledgement of justice done right. Even the court reporter smiled. Michael's head dropped into his hands. Tears leaked between his fingers. For 6 months, he'd lived with the fear of losing his daughter. Now that fear was gone. Evelyn reached over and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle but firm, the same way she'd comforted him when he was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Regarding visitation, Morales continued, the petitioner is granted supervised visits only, 2 hours per week to be monitored by court-appointed personnel. It was a harsh restriction, but necessary. Brooke had proven she couldn't be trusted alone with the child. Finally, the petitioner's request for spousal support is denied. Given the evidence of fraudulent intent, this court finds no basis for financial compensation. Hawthorne slumped in his chair. His client would walk away with nothing. Less than nothing if the criminal charges stuck. Morales set down his legal pad. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. When he replaced them, his eyes found Evelyn's. Before this court adjourns, he said, I want to address something that goes beyond the legal issues at hand. The courtroom fell silent. Even the whispers stopped. 25 years ago, I sat where Ms. Brooke Calloway sits today, defeated, disgraced, facing the consequences of my own poor choices. His voice carried across the room like a prayer. Personal, and intimate, but strong enough for everyone to hear. The woman sitting at the defense table could have remained silent. She could have let corruption win, because fighting it would cost her everything. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. The memory of that long-ago decision, the price she'd paid for doing what was right. Instead, she chose justice over comfort, truth over safety. She lost her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for. Morales looked directly at her now. His voice grew softer but more intense. But justice doesn't die, Mrs. Carter. It just waits for someone brave enough to revive it. The words hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Sacred. Permanent. Brooke had been staring at the table throughout the judge's speech. Now she looked up, her eyes wide with something that might have been understanding or regret. It wasn't supposed to end like this, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but everyone heard it. The admission of someone whose carefully laid plans had come apart in her hands. Hawthorne was already packing his briefcase. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat written across his shoulders. He'd taken what seemed like an easy case and watched it become a professional embarrassment. This court is adjourned, Morales announced. The gavel came down with finality. The sound echoed off the courtroom walls like the closing of a heavy door. People began filing out slowly. The drama was over, but no one seemed eager to leave. They'd witnessed something rare. A moment when the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Michael wiped his eyes and looked up at his mother. For the first time in months, he was smiling. Mom, he said quietly, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Evelyn replied. You're my son. She stood and gathered her papers. The old briefcase closed with the same authoritative click it had made 30 years ago. Some things never changed. Some things shouldn't change. Emma appeared at Michael's side, having been brought in by the social worker who'd been monitoring the case. The little girl's face was bright with relief, though she didn't fully understand what had just happened. Daddy, she said, climbing onto his lap. Are we going home now? Yes, sweetheart, Michael said, hugging her tight. We're going home. As they prepared to leave, Brooke stood at the plaintiff's table. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The confidence and arrogance had drained away, leaving only a woman who'd gambled everything and lost. She watched Evelyn help Michael gather his papers, watched Emma chatter excitedly about going home, watched the family she'd tried to destroy come together again. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. The words came out louder than she'd intended. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her. Evelyn paused at the counsel table. She studied Brooke's face, looking for sincerity, for genuine remorse. I know you are, she said finally, but sorry doesn't undo the damage. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was simply acknowledgement. The recognition that people make choices, and choices have consequences. Brooke nodded slowly. She understood. The courtroom was nearly empty now. Only the court reporter remained, packing up her equipment. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Evelyn walked beside Michael's wheelchair as they moved toward the exit. Emma skipped ahead, her white shoes clicking against the marble. The sound echoed like music in the vast space. At the courtroom door, Evelyn paused and looked back. Judge Morales was still at his bench, reviewing papers for the next case. He looked up and met her eyes one last time. He nodded slightly, a gesture of respect between two people who'd learned the hard way that justice was worth fighting for. Then Evelyn turned and followed her family into the hallway. The corridor was busy with lawyers and clients hurrying to other courtrooms. Other cases. Other battles between right and wrong. The wheels of justice never stopped turning. But for one afternoon in one courtroom, the system had worked perfectly. Michael reached out and took his mother's hand as they waited for the elevator. His grip was strong despite everything he'd been through. The man who'd lost the use of his legs had found his strength in other ways. "What now?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. It was the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. "Now we go home," she said, "and we live our lives." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As they stepped inside, Evelyn caught a glimpse of herself in the polished steel doors. The Queen of Law was still there, older, grayer, but unbroken. She'd returned to the courtroom one last time. She'd fought for her family. She'd won. Some battles were worth everything they cost. The doors closed, and they descended toward the lobby, toward the sunlight, toward home. Justice had been served. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in courtroom 302. Spring had arrived in Schaumburg with gentle persistence, painting the world in soft greens and pale yellows. The oak trees that lined the Carter Street wore new leaves like delicate jewelry. Inside the house that Thomas Carter had built brick by brick, morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. The light was golden and warm, carrying the promise of better days. It fell across the wooden table where flour dusted the surface like snow. Emma stood on a step stool beside the counter, her small hands covered in cookie dough. At 7 years old, she'd grown taller over the winter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that bounced when she moved. She wore a pink apron that was too big for her, tied twice around her waist. "Grandma, I think I put too much flour," she said, giggling. Evelyn stood beside her, her own hands dusty with baking. Her silver hair was pulled back loosely. She wore a simple blue dress and the same apron she'd used when Michael was Emma's age. "Some traditions deserve to continue. There's no such thing as too much flour, sweetheart," Evelyn said gently. "We just add a little more butter." She guided Emma's hands as they kneaded the dough. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and cinnamon, of home and safety and love. These were the moments that mattered. Not the courtroom victories or legal battles, but the quiet times when families came together. Through the window, they could see Michael on the back porch. He sat in his wheelchair, but beside him stood a pair of metal leg braces, the kind that allowed limited movement for people with spinal injuries. He'd been working with a physical therapist for 4 months now. The insurance company had finally approved the treatment. Sometimes justice came in small increments rather than dramatic victories. Michael wore jeans and a white t-shirt. His arms were stronger now from months of physical therapy. His face had color again. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long was finally gone. He was reading a technical manual about electrical systems. The state had approved him for retraining as an electrical inspector, a job he could do from an office or vehicle, a way to use his knowledge without climbing scaffolding. The morning air was crisp but warming. Birds sang in the maple tree that shaded the porch, the same tree where he'd built Emma a swing 2 summers ago, the same tree where his father had taught him to change a car's oil. Some roots went deeper than time or tragedy. Inside the kitchen, Emma had moved on to cutting cookie shapes. Her small tongue poked out the corner of her mouth in concentration. Each cookie was slightly different, but all made with love. "Grandma," she said quietly, "will Mommy Brooke ever come back?" Evelyn paused in her mixing. The question still came sometimes. Children processed loss differently than adults. They needed time to understand that some changes were permanent. "She comes to visit you every Saturday," Evelyn said carefully. "I know. But will she come back to live here?" "No, sweetheart. This is your home with Daddy and me." Emma nodded solemnly. She was learning that families came in different shapes. That love mattered more than structure. The supervised visits had continued as ordered by the court. Brooke arrived every Saturday at 10 in the morning with a social worker. She took Emma to the park or for ice cream. The visits were awkward but civil. Brooke had changed too. The criminal charges had been dropped in exchange for community service and counseling. She'd lost her real estate license but found work as a receptionist in a medical office. The humility looked strange on her, but it seemed genuine. She'd never apologized directly to Michael. Some wounds were too deep for words. But she'd stopped fighting the custody arrangement. Sometimes that was the closest thing to redemption that broken people could manage. The oven timer chimed, interrupting Evelyn's thoughts. The first batch of cookies was ready. Emma clapped her hands as Evelyn pulled the tray from the oven. The cookies were golden brown and perfect. "Can we take some to Daddy?" Emma asked. Of course. They arranged warm cookies on a plate and walked outside. The porch steps creaked under their feet, but the sound was friendly, familiar, the voice of a house that had weathered many storms. Michael looked up from his manual as they approached. His smile was the first thing visitors noticed now. It lit up his whole face the way it had when he was young. "Something smells amazing," he said. Emma climbed onto his lap with the plate of cookies. She learned to be careful around his legs, but she wasn't afraid of his wheelchair anymore. It was just part of who her daddy was now. "We made chocolate chip," she announced proudly. Michael took a bite and closed his eyes in exaggerated bliss. "Best cookies in the world." Evelyn settled into the wicker chair beside them. The porch furniture was old but comfortable. She'd bought it 20 years ago when Michael was in high school, back when her biggest worry was whether he'd remember to call when he got to his friend's house. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson was working in her garden. She waved when she saw them. The neighborhood had rallied around the Carter family during the worst days, bringing casseroles and offers to babysit, proving that good people still existed in the world. "Mom," Michael said quietly, his voice suddenly serious. Evelyn looked at him. She could read the gratitude in his eyes, the love and respect that didn't need words. "You saved us," he said simply. The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. He wasn't just talking about the court case. He was talking about everything. The months of despair when he'd wanted to give up. The nights when he'd wondered if Emma would be better off without him. The darkness that had almost consumed them all. Evelyn reached over and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was spotted with age, but her grip was still strong. "No," she said softly. "Justice saved us. I just remembered how to fight." It was true. The law hadn't saved them. Love had. Family had. The decision to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. The choice to fight when fighting seemed futile. Emma finished her cookie and snuggled against her father's chest. She was content in the way children were when they felt completely safe. When they knew the adults in their lives would protect them from whatever storms might come. Across the street, the bells of St. Matthew's Church began to ring. It was 11 o'clock, time for Sunday service. The same bells that had marked time in this neighborhood for 50 years. The same bells that had rung during Michael's childhood, during his wedding, during Emma's baptism. But today the sound was different. Not a warning or a call to duty, just a peaceful reminder that time passed and life continued, and good people found ways to survive the worst that the world could throw at them. Evelyn closed her eyes and listened to the bells. She thought about the courtroom where she'd made her stand, about Judge Morales and the second chances he'd given both of them. About the young woman she'd been when she first carried a briefcase into that same building 30 years ago. The Queen of Law was sleeping again, retired once more to her kitchen and garden and granddaughter's laughter. But she wasn't gone. She would never be gone. Some things were too important to let die. "Truth can sleep," she whispered to herself, "but it never dies." The words were carried away by the spring breeze. They mixed with the sound of church bells and children playing in distant yards, with the rustle of new leaves and the promise of better days ahead. Michael adjusted Emma's position on his lap. Soon he would practice walking with his braces, one step at a time across the porch, then down the ramp he'd built to the sidewalk, then maybe to the corner and back. Progress measured in footsteps rather than miles. Victory measured in moments rather than years. The sun climbed higher, warming the wooden boards of the porch, warming the faces of three people who'd learned that families could survive anything as long as they remembered how to hold on to each other. Evelyn opened her eyes and smiled. There was work to do, lunch to prepare, laundry to fold, a granddaughter to raise, and a son to encourage. The simple, sacred work of living. The storm had passed. The damage had been repaired. The family had endured. And somewhere in the distance, church bells continued to ring. Not as a warning this time, but as a promise. Peace was possible. Justice was real. Love would always find a way. The Carter family was home, based on true emotions. Names changed to protect the